We're starting at
yes.
7, but we can.
There are a
the
few minutes.
YouTube people don't just log out and yeah.
Of course.
Live, sir.
Sir, now we are in live, sir.
YouTube live.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We still have 4 minutes left, and Steve, before you joined, I have told all other panelists that each question, you can take maximum 5 minutes. But in the end, we want to provide at least 10 minutes for Q&A, and we're collecting questions on the YouTube live, and they will be read out by the Master of Ceremonies, Kajal Parwani, who is working with the Center for Human Rights Studies at RV University. And thereafter, you can answer those questions.
I'll try. Okay.
I've slightly changed the order of questions. So I'm trying to deal with the challenges in the first and then go to the solutions part. And so Professor Sudarshan, like the use of nuclear weapons by Russia goes up. And then what can UN do about these challenges will come later. And
by the way, Professor Murthy, did you see my?
Yes, I've used that only. I've used the changes I've used. I've seen that.
Thank you.
Do your changes affect us, Veslin?
No,
I don't know. Which question goes first?
Let me.
I think mine is second. What are the contemporary threats to international peace and security?
Oh yes, of course. First is to Professor Marx about the root causes of conflict.
Yes, it goes well to start with root causes and then go contemporary.
Okay. Yeah.
There is a certain logic to that, but my problem is that for each of these 5-minute presentations, I prepared a 45-minute talk.
So we need a very strict moderator, whoever that is. Kajal, you are going to.
I will. But
use your authority
with your permission beforehand, and yes.
we all need to be cautioned. We like to speak too long, but we will try to be disciplined.
We have 30 seconds to go.
Okay.
And especially this topic, you can go endless actually.
Oh yes.
Because the topic is like that. I can understand.
Kajal, will you be doing the countdown?
5 more seconds.
Hand it over to the
3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everybody. Self-collary. Meeting call to order. Over to you, Kajal.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Human Rights Studies, School of Law, RV University, and Rotary E-Club of Bangalore, District 3190, I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists and viewers who are joining us through YouTube to this webinar on peace and conflict resolution. This webinar is being held in observance of Peace, Conflict, Prevention and Resolution Month by Rotary in February every year. Now, we all witnessed the loss of lives and mass destruction that was brought about by Russia's war against Ukraine. As per UN data, there have been 18,995 casualties up until 13th of February 2023, and over 8 million people have fled Ukraine due to the conflict. These are just the numbers from one region. Similarly, there are many armed conflicts, both international and non-international, that are raging in many parts of the world. There are many questions now that arise about the source of the conflict and causes of the conflict, the adequacy of the legal framework, the steps that can be taken by different actors to curb the emergence of these conflicts. And today, our panelists will be addressing some of these burning questions. Now I would like to call upon President Rotary E-Club of Bangalore, District 3190, Rotarian Ms. Kavita Subramaniam to deliver her welcome address.
Thank you so much, Kajal. Good evening once again to all the distinguished speakers, Rotarians, and its my dear friends. I bring greetings from Rotary International President Jennifer Jones and our District Governor of District 3190, Rotarian Jitendra Aneja. As Kajal has already mentioned, in the month of February, the entire month is observed in the month as the Rotary Peace and Conflict Resolution Month, dedicated to promote peace and conflict resolution around the world. It was initiated by Rotary International. During Rotary Peace and Conflict Resolution Month, Rotary clubs and individuals around the world, organizations, various activities and events to raise awareness about peace and conflict resolution, and to take action to promote peace in their communities and beyond. This month is an opportunity for individuals and organizations to come together and promote peace and to build a more peaceful world. Today, in association with RV University and Rotary E-Club of Bangalore 3190, we bring you a panel discussion with eminent speakers to talk about peace and conflict resolution. I wholeheartedly thank Y.S.R. Murthy sir, Vice Chancellor of RV University, in helping us organizing this event, which I am sure will be meaningful to all of us. Peace is essentially for the well-being and development of individuals, communities, and nations. Peaceful society provides a safe and secure environment for people to live and work. This helps in improving the physical and mental health of people and contribute to their overall well-being. Peaceful society are more likely to attract foreign investments, create jobs, and provide opportunity for economic growth. This can lead to increased prosperity, better infrastructure, and a higher standard of living. Peaceful society promote social harmony and reduce tensions between different group of people. This helps in increasing an inclusive and tolerant society where people can live together in harmony. Peace is also essential for environmental sustainability. Conflicts and war can lead to environmental distraction, displacement of people, and destruction of natural resources. Peaceful resolution between countries are essential for international cooperation and resolution for global issues such as climate change, poverty, and diseases. In conclusion, peace is a fundamental aspect of human life and development. It is essential for the well-being and prosperity of individuals, communities, and nations. Therefore, promoting peace should be a priority of individuals, organizations, as well as governments. It's my pleasure to welcome all the eminent speakers for the day and wish that the world we live in is more peaceful and happiness flooded. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I welcome you all. Over to you, Kajal.
Thank you, Ms. Subramaniam. Without any further delay, I would like to invite Vice Chancellor, RV University, Dr. Y.S.R. Murthy, our moderator for this session, to outline the context for our discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Kajal. Good evening, friends. Warm greetings to all the distinguished panelists, Rotarians who are participating in this Zoom webinar, and as well as those who are participating in the YouTube live streaming session. The Center for Human Rights Studies School of Law, RV University, is happy to partner with Rotary E-Club of Bangalore, District 3190, to organize this webinar on peace. I'm thankful to the president of that club, Rotarian Ms. Kavita Subramaniam, and all members of the board for partnering with us. In 2022, we witnessed the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The war is now 1 year old. Up until February 2023, there have been 18,995 casualties as per UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, in his recent address to the General Assembly, said, and I quote, "The chances of further escalation and bloodshed keep growing. I fear the world is not sleepwalking into a wider war. I fear it is doing so with its eyes wide open," unquote. There are at least 110 ongoing international and non-international armed conflicts in the world. According to UN High Commissioner for Refugees data, 117 million people are either stateless or displaced. That indeed is a staggering number. The quantum of destruction is immeasurable. Groups like women and children are subjected to heightened suffering due to their vulnerability. Violation of women's rights in Afghanistan is an apt example. There can be several reasons for the eruption of a conflict, like competition for scarce resources, climate change, authoritarian regimes, and demand for more political space, extremist religious movements, etc. The UN Secretary General, in a report, noted the need for a new agenda for peace. The agenda includes a peace continuum that focuses on 6 areas such as reducing strategic risks, investing, prevention, peace building, reshaping our responses to all forms of violence, and strengthening international foresight and capacities. The areas are based on the underlying reasons that drive and sustain present-day conflicts. Ladies and gentlemen, today, use of artificial intelligence in defense is a reality. It has not yet been subjected to regulation under international law. There have been increasing concerns over things such as AI-guided drones, slaughter bots that can kill with no human intervention, and the risk that AI could escalate military conflict. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, in a recent statement issued a few days back on 18th February 2023 said, and I quote, "I am deeply disturbed by the potential for harm of recent advances in artificial intelligence. Human agency, human dignity, and all human rights are at risk. There's an urgent call for both business and governments to develop quickly effective guardrails that are so urgently needed," unquote. The objective of this webinar is to identify existing as well as emerging threats to international peace and security, and also come up with some practical strategies and solutions to address them. In this process, we wish to draw public attention to these critical matters. We have a very distinguished panel of experts. It is my honor and privilege to introduce them to you. First, Professor Sudarshan is a Rhodes Scholar and a development economist. He went to University of Oxford and Cambridge. He has worked in the Ford Foundation and later on in UNDP for more than 2 decades in various capacities across many world capitals. He is currently the founding dean, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at OP Jindal Global University. His expertise revolves around governance, development, justice, rule of law, and human rights. Second, we have Professor Stephen Marks. He's a dean of Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development at OP Jindal Global University. And he is Francois Xavier Bagnaud, Professor of Health and Human Rights, Emeritus at Harvard University, with degrees in law and international relations from Stanford and several universities in France, as well as the Syrian Arab Republic. He has worked for the US Senate in Washington, D.C., the International Institute of Human Rights based in Strasbourg in France, UNESCO, the Ford Foundation, and UN peacekeeping operations in Cambodia and Western Sahara. He has taught at several universities, including Columbia University and Princeton University, before serving as a tenured professor at Harvard from 1999 to 2022. Last but not the least, Professor Vasilin Popowski has served as a senior academic officer at the United Nations University in Tokyo from 2004 to 2014. After 2007, he was appointed as the head of its Peace and Governance Program and also head of the United Nations University Press in 2010. In 2002 to 2004, Professor Popowski has the distinction of co-directing the European Union project on legal protection of individual rights in Russian Federation. He is currently Professor and Vice Dean and Executive Director, Center for the Study of United Nations at Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. We have this interesting panel and I have a few questions. First question is directed to Professor Stephen Marks, who has a wealth of experience of many decades of working in peace and security. Dr. Marks, what in your assessment are the root causes of conflicts?
Thank you very much, YSR. It is indeed an honor for me to join this distinguished panel. To address the root causes of conflict in 5 minutes is quite a challenge. I'm going to address it. I'm going to even complicate the subject by appealing to 2 different meanings of root causes, in my view. The first is reflected in the UN Secretary General's new agenda for peace, which you cited, which, as he said, should boost our investment in prevention and peace building by addressing the root causes of conflict. This concept of root causes was central to the 2 global compacts that were adopted as a result of emergence of conflicts a few years ago. And in the Global Compact on Refugees, we can read that protection and caring for refugees is life-saving for the individual, but in the first instance, addressing the root causes is the responsibility of countries at the origin of refugee movements. Now, in the conflicts that we're dealing with today, of course, refugee movements are major, but the international community is saying, hang on. Yes, the refugees are the problem we're trying to address with relief, but what are the root causes? And we have a global compact asking us to do so. In a similar, quite rational concern is expressed in the Secretary General's approach to the concept of responsibility to protect. He wrote, addressing the root causes of systemic patterns of discrimination and human rights violations is likely to make a difference. And he said, let's not forget that the responsibility to protect emerged from the 2005 UN World Summit, which called on states to build consensus on major threats and challenges, which must be translated, quote, into concrete action, including addressing the root causes of these threats and challenges, which resolve and determination. So basically, the root causes are state behavior contrary to the core norms of Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations principle, of what's being that we're observing today, Article 2.4, which is frankly in tatters, that calls upon all member states to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. But what I want to do in the short time that I have is to suggest to you a second meaning of root causes. Again, you can see the political need to go back and say, why do we have all these refugees? Why do we have all these deaths? There are root causes we need to address. But a deeper meaning is, and if I can be so bold as to call it ontological, axiological, and epistemological exploration of what has been referred to as the better the better angels of our nature. What does science, specifically evolutionary biology and neuroscience, tell us about the root causes of conflict among our species? To understand the extent to which it is, quote, natural for humans to engage in killing one another or to aspire towards cooperation and mutual respect, and I can't resist quoting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, referring to the duty to act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood, we need to inquire into the concepts of altruism and empathy. Are they natural, or are the causes based on something that is deeply embedded in human nature to attack and kill one another? There's a vast literature on this topic, and I'm particularly influenced by Wilson's notice of eusociality, which points out that in the evolution of our species, there are definitely features that are egoistical and that lead to acts of violence. But there are other species that have, in the history of natural selection, preserved our species because of cooperation. So in sum, political root causes of the horrors of refugee flows and civilian deaths are al-Assad's repression of the Arab Spring and Putin's obsession with NATO and desire to reconquer the former territories that the Soviet Union used to control. To name but two current cases and efforts to address the root causes in the context of responsibility to protect and the global compact. But the deeper root causes in human nature are the tensions between the natural self-preservation instinct in the individual, family, and community level versus the equally natural eusociality that make altruism and cooperation possible. I firmly believe that al-Assad and Putin are the aberrations, and the founders of the United Nations and those who voted for the resolutions of the General Assembly in the emergency session 11 on Ukraine represent a deeply rooted potential for peace and security embedded in human nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marks, for throwing light on the root causes of conflict in a very short, brief span of time. And my next question is directed to Professor Popovsky. You have been researching and you have been writing on issues relating to peace. What, in your assessment, are the contemporary threats to international peace and security?
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Professor Murthy. In fact, I will follow from what my dear friend Professor Marks just said by stating that although we live in the 21st century, our institutions are 20th century, but some political leaders, and he named two at least of them, act as if they are in the 19th century or even earlier than that. If you asked me this question, Professor Murthy, 10 years ago, I would have probably spent a longer time that I will do today on explaining the non-traditional threats, the climate change, the extreme weather events. But what we would witness and what our opening remarks also suggested is that we have this huge leap back into the time where some leaders prefer to act in a world without the rule of law, without the international system, without the respect for human life, for human rights, and so on. So the war in Ukraine somehow brings us that sobriety, that reality, that in fact we have the non-traditional threats in parallel with what already existed a long time ago. Remember the book by Marie Kaldor? Well, she wrote it 20 years ago, and she called it the New and Old Wars, effectively arguing that the nature of conflict has changed. We are no longer in the time where one state invades another state and where the conflicts are mostly between states. Rather, we live in a world where the conflicts are mostly internal, where governments fight rebels, and both sides sometimes violate the rules of war. They recruit child soldiers, they engage in very often in sexual violence, targeting of civilians. So the nature of the war today, she argues, and I'm talking about this 20 years ago, has dramatically changed. We have witnessed that. In fact, we have a lot of civil wars. Syria was mentioned, Myanmar. We can go on in several places in Africa where we have the continuance of civil war, which basically challenges our institutions, exactly because the United Nations was established at the time where the major preoccupation was the traditional armed conflict in the ruins of the Second World War. The mechanisms of the UN Charter were very much supposed to address exactly the interstate war rather than civil war, rather than rebellions, insurgencies. And for that matter, the challenge we have is how to apply those mechanisms, Chapter 6, Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, to situations which were developed over times and that are much more challenging to address with those traditional mechanisms, such as mediation, arbitrations, negotiations, judicial settlement, judicial review in Chapter 6, but also in sense of the Chapter 7 measures such as economic and diplomatic sanctions, and at the last resort, the use of force. If we look at how the Security Council can define the contemporary threats to international peace and security, we will also see quite an evolution since the organization was established 75 years ago. We will see that often, for example, terrorist organization, or on the opposite, the non-extradition of terrorist suspects by some governments, Libya, Sudan, later Afghanistan, have been defined as threats to international peace and security. We can take also non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction as another example of how the Security Council redefined the traditional threats to international peace and security, and situations such as Iraq, Iran, North Korea. In several occasions, the Chapter 7 was applied to states for those threats arising out of failure of states to disarm or to develop, on another hand, weapons of mass destruction. We also see resolutions that address denial of democracy. In good case was Haiti in 1994 or Sierra Leone in 1999, several resolutions in the context of Africa, peace and security. We also see the kind of development of the Security Council determination of threats to international peace and security to cover situations of coup d'etat, denial of elected president in office, military junta taking over the power, In one resolution, even the Security Council named that any coup d'etat will amount automatically to a threat to international peace and security. In other words, if we add all of those into the what we call non-traditional threats, the climate change, the warming up of the temperature, the sea level rise, and the connected extreme weather events, which actually produce a lot of damage. We see the flooding in Pakistan last year, we see the fires in the Amazon and in many other parts of the world. We'll see the massive migration because of climate change. And again, Professor Marx mentioned the challenge of refugees, but that's applicable as well for the non-traditional threats.
Professor Popowski, will come back to you. And
exactly. I want
yeah.
to just say that it's an accumulation of old threats, but also of contemporary development of those threats. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Popowski. I'll take off one of the observations you mentioned about the war in Ukraine. My next question is directed to Professor Sudarshan. Professor Sudarshan, like Russia has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and what is the magnitude of that challenge?
Well, thank you very much. I think I first thank you, Professor Murthy, for at the outset outlining the basis for our conversation by alluding to several key developments in the world, including the reference to war in Ukraine. I have to say, though, that firstly, the United Nations, since it was established, has managed to prevent so far a world war. Just think of it, that the time span between the First World War and the Second World War was barely 2 decades. And we now have a situation where the United Nations has been in existence since 1945. And we've averted a world war. Now, we often don't think about what hasn't happened, but it could have easily happened. And the fact that it didn't happen, a good deal of the credit must go to this institution. And one of the things this institution has established is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Unfortunately, many countries are not signatory to it. India is not. And at some point, India, which was very anti-nuclear in its, if you like, its civilizational standpoint about world peace, decided that it would become a nuclear power. Nonetheless, there is the International Atomic Energy Agency. There are mechanisms by which the deployment of nuclear weapons is monitored by the United Nations agency. And actually, the number of deadly warheads has come down over the period, particularly with the agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union then, and later Russia. So there is a bit of saber rattling that Russia is now doing, because it's on the back foot, in a way, not winning the war in the Ukraine. But I don't think the use of any nuclear weapon in this context is going to be very realistic. Now, you may say, some mad person can push the button, but in fact, in all countries, whether it's India or Pakistan, I won't make the claim about North Korea, but certainly Russia, there are a number of checks and balances before a nuclear weapon could be deployed. So it cannot be the case that even if, for some strange psychological reason, the leader in Russia, Mr. Putin, who's generally regarded as imbalanced in some contexts, decides that he needs that option, it's very unlikely that anyone in his establishment and regime will enable him to do it. So I think there are a number of checks within countries over the deployment of nuclear weapons because the consequences are so horrific. And so the other concern really is not so much nuclear, but what you alluded to, which is that the boundary between civilian use of technology and military use of technology is getting blurred, that artificial intelligence enables the deployment of drones that can be deadly and kill a lot of civilians. So it's those kinds of dangers that I think are looming, and we, as you mentioned, we need to get down to work on how to protect civilians in the context of conflicts from assaults by such weapons. So as for the nuclear, I would say that I think there's a certain maturity in the world after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that that is not really an option. At some point, people believed that being a nuclear power is a deterrence, but that too is no longer the case. And I think, therefore, even between India and Pakistan, I don't think there's ever a chance that any nuclear weapon would be deployed for the reasons that I mentioned, which is that even if a authoritarian leader wills it, there are enough checks and balances in countries that would prevent that. So the President of the United States or Mr. Putin can't just wake up one night, press a button and release an onslaught of nuclear weapons. It's out of the question. So I wouldn't say that's a big risk.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan, for nicely explaining the context and also how sometimes there's a saber rattling by some of the powers engaged in a conflict, and also the highlighting the challenge posed by proliferation of nuclear weapons and NPT. For those who are following this webinar on YouTube Live, I have an announcement. You have heard the root causes of conflict and also contemporary threats and also the nature of challenges highlighted by Professor Sudarshan. In case you have any questions, please jot them down in the chat box provided in the YouTube, and they will be passed on to the Master of Ceremonies, and they will be posted to the panelists here. And going further, my next question is addressed to Professor Stephen Marks. There is a threat of the use of killer robots and use of lethal autonomous systems. What is the nature of this challenge posed by these new technologies?
Difficult question, but for your listeners, there's a utilization of the word laws that they might want to learn about. Actually, this is called LAWS laws, but what does that mean? It means lethal autonomous weapon systems. What are they? And how are they, or should they be regulated? To explore the nature of this challenge, we need to consider first whether what these weapons can do, and secondly, whether new measures are needed to protect humanity from a new threat. Laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems, have also been described as, quote, the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear arms. Let's start with an example so you know what these weapons are. Harop is a kamikaze drone which Israeli Aerospace Industries, IAI, has been selling for more than a decade to a number of countries, including India and Germany. Harop, according to a study by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is one of 49 deployed systems which could detect possible targets and attack them without human intervention. There are many developments taking place more recently using AI for similar weapons. There are, of course, many weapons that strike their targets without human intervention. Landmines, we've had them for generations. Phalanx guns used on ships that are not the same type of weapons that are creating the immediate concern now over these types of weapons using advanced artificial intelligence. It has been said that the algorithms that they use and the onboard machine learning create what's one author has called a field day for ethicists and a nightmare for the would-be treaty makers. Another dilemma of laws of these types of weapons is how they relate to respect for the laws governing armed conflict, international humanitarian law. It is interesting to observe that weapons such as Samsung's SGR-A1 sentry gun can, quote, recognize hands being thrown into the air and weapons to the ground as signs of surrender that mean do not shoot, and thus can be more reliable protector of international humanitarian law than human warriors. Think for a minute what that means. That we might be inclined to say, take away the human role in this, and you have a danger that we must prevent. But consider that the technology might actually provide the use of weapons in ways that are less harmful to human beings than others. Well, the question was anticipated actually in Article 36 of the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, which called upon states to review the legality and of new weapon systems. And this is what's being applied now in the context of the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, CCW. And a group of governmental experts is seeking to develop a common understanding of what weapons should be considered fully autonomous, and is considering both the blanket ban and other options for dealing with the humanitarian security challenge that they create. India chairs this governmental group reflecting on these issues, but it is reserving its position, not, quote, wanting to repeat a repeat of nuclear history in which technological have-nots were locked out of game-changing weaponry by a discriminatory treaty. America, Britain, and Russia also explicitly opposed the ban. So since 2013, there has been a campaign to stop killer robots. Human Rights Watch and 160 other NGOs have been seeking to remove these weapons and find a permanent ban on them. Others have criticized this, and I won't go into the details because time is running out. And I will conclude by saying that the issue of the nature of the challenge posed by LAWS turns on the complexities of banning weapons that involve a wide range of applications of artificial intelligence to warfare, some of which are clearly harmful to protecting the victims of armed conflict, such as lack of human control over the launching of deadly force under evolving circumstances interpreted by machine learning, and others of which may in fact protect such victims, such as weapons that accurately identify combatants who seek to surrender, in the example I just gave. So the campaign to stop killer robots is waging a noble battle to protect us from these weapons, but it remains to be seen whether a protocol to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons will do the trick. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marks. Professor Popovsky, my next question is directed to you, and it takes off from the challenges highlighted by Professor Marks. What are the gaps in the current international law for addressing these emergent threats to international peace and security?
Thank you. Excellent question. In fact, I will start with the major gap, or the lack of reform of the United Nations Charter and the power of the veto, which is, for me at least, a profound initial danger because once we see that the permanent 5 members utilizing the veto and sheltering regimes such the one in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, to continue crimes against humanity over more than a decade, or to shelter itself in the case of Russia, Ukraine. I cannot start by saying that without revision of the United Nations Charter and elimination of the power of the veto, we might not see much of a progress. We might experience another decade of civil wars with genocidal policies, crimes against humanity, big powers invading middle and small powers, and not much will change. And one big jeopardy there is that the United Nations Charter itself, to be amended, demands the ratification of exactly those permanent 5 members with the power of veto. So again, I have been written a lot about the composition of the UN Security Council, the working methods, limitations, and some of those were achieved through the resolution of the General Assembly demanding that every time the Security Council has a veto, the issue immediately, automatically goes to the General Assembly for a special session. Almost the same text of the resolution vetoed by the Security Council can be then adopted by the General Assembly, which actually happened a couple of times. Nevertheless, if we want to see a fundamental progress and filling that major, I'll call it black hole in the middle of the global governance, we might face a situation of what I call a new San Francisco moment, where if one or two of the permanent 5s do not ratify amendments, then the rest of the world might decide to go and establish a new organization and adopt a new UN Charter, which does not have the power of the veto. Quickly about the other gaps, and I will say someone mentioned already the gap in regulation of the lethal autonomous weapon system, the gaps in regulation of artificial intelligence, and I know many teams are working on that. How can we kind of be behind, in front of the time and not left behind with the rapid development of technologies that will allow a lot of decision making even to be taken by artificial intelligence, how we as humans we will respond to those challenges and will regulate internationally, globally, the artificial intelligence. And I will also talk a little bit about the gap in focus. We have legislations and we have many international conventions and law, but the real gap often is the implementation rather than the codification. Do states really comply with already existing conventions, and how to make them more compliant, how to enforce international law in a way that states become compliant. We have the Climate Change Treaty in Paris, the Paris Agreement for Climate Change, which somehow shifted international law into more the soft law, where states make voluntary commitments rather than obligatory commitment. Although the Paris Agreement suggests the legally binding character, nevertheless, there are no sanctions against states that do not rise into the level of commitment as to reduce the CO2 emissions. So for that matter, I think we need to think in parallel of filling gaps in codification, but also how to make the existing law much more implemented and how to incentivize, in addition to sanction, states that do not comply with international law. Again, big questions, and it's difficult to give the answer today, but I'm happy if there are audience's questions on that to follow up on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pawlowski, for highlighting the veto power and also the need for more scrupulous adherence to implementation. And now my next question is addressed to Professor Sudarshan, who has spent several decades in the United Nations Development Program in senior leadership roles. Professor Sudarshan, what can United Nations do to address the contemporary threats to international peace and security?
Well, that's a large question, Professor Murthy. What I have to say is, we take note of, conflicts, the invasion of Ukraine, things that go wrong. and we don't pay so much attention to things that might have gone wrong but have not gone wrong. And I think in the record of looking at the United Nations, I mean, certainly in need of reforms, the Security Council, but there's also the other arm of the United Nations, which focuses on something that manages to prevent a lot of conflicts, which is its work in development. And in that respect, all of the UN agencies taken together have done signal service to humanity over a period of time. And they have managed to avert many kinds of conflicts, beginning with governance reforms in many countries, which, had they not been undertaken with the encouragement and support of the United Nations, would have produced serious conflicts. Or you, just to illustrate that for people closer home in India, India has handled a number of conflicts very deftly by having a very asymmetric form of federalism. We've managed to tackle at one point what seemed to be a secessionist movement on the part of the Tamil-speaking population in the country. The Dravidian movement threatened secession, but because of deft handling of federal relations, that challenge was overcome. The Gorkhas had a challenge. They wanted a separate state, but that was handled by giving them a degree of autonomy within the state of West Bengal. We handled Pakistan. So I think governance and techniques and strategies of governance in individual countries have actually contributed to averting a whole lot of conflicts and to generally maintain peace. And the United Nations has played a significant role in that. Take Timor-Leste, which, there was violence when the Indonesian army withdrew, slash and burn, but they helped create a new state, created a constitution for it. That process was not quite the same in Afghanistan, because the United Nations was a minor player, and the international coalition of the willing supporters wanted a hastily drawn up constitution. And we now have another situation where the Taliban have come back to power, which they held before the international and the American forces came into Afghanistan. So I'd say, therefore, that in a number of these areas, particularly with respect to so one of the big challenges really that we have to address is growing inequality in the world, because inequality is one of the root causes to take off from what Steve Marx said. Inequality is a root cause of conflict and a danger to peace. And the present system that we have, which has generally been supported by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, has created a system that perpetuates inequalities, that increases inequalities, that actually produces poverty. If you're continually producing poverty, your measures to alleviate poverty are not going to go so far, because inherent in the system is processes that produce poverty, that keep a certain class of people under the conditions in which they are. Now, if you, on the other hand, if you look at what is it that the United Nations took upon itself to do, eradication of smallpox, success. Eradication of polio, almost 100% success. COVID and the handling of COVID, to get the international community to understand that there's a necessity for a certain measure of equity in the distribution of vaccines the UN played a major role. HIV/AIDS was tackled by the United Nations in a similar manner. So in all of the targets or goals that the UN agencies have set for themselves, compared to the Bretton Woods institutions of the World Bank and the IMF, the record of the United Nations agencies is undoubtedly superior. So that raises the question then, what are we to do about, one major source of conflict and the threat to peace, which is inequality. And that's in a way embedded in the system that we now have. And to break out of it is a challenge, but it's not that there are no alternatives and things cannot be tried within respective nation states to do so. So that's, and the UN, I think, is a generator of good ideas for such action to be taken by respective countries. So on the one hand, the record of the Security Council with its use of vetoes is not something to be, proud about, but the record of the UN system in its development work is something that is quite commendable and that has contributed significantly. So in that respect, I'd say that the United Nations has been willing to partner with a number of organizations, with civil society, with private sector, with businesses, and most importantly, with the Rotary Club all over the world. So the capacity of UN systems in the UN country offices to connect with the resources of the Rotarians, their tap on their idealism and their commitment to foster peace. The best ally that the Rotary Club has in its mission to promote world peace is the United Nations and the United Nations agencies in every country. So therefore, I'd say that, instead of looking at it quite as the glass half empty and wailing, I think it's very creditable what the United Nations has achieved in cooperation with. It took some time before the UN acknowledged the importance of civil society and the role of civil society in preventing conflicts, but the UN has done it. It's also acknowledged the importance of private sector, businesses, corporate social responsibility, and all of that, the compact with business. All of these are positive developments, and in the end, they'd add up to a lot, because what they achieve is not measured in a newspaper headline, which will miss it. But that goes on every day. And I think we have a lot to be grateful for. I must say, though, I've served the United Nations for 22 years, so you must forgive me for being, I'm not exactly an objective or an impartial commentator on it, but to the extent that I'm now an academic and I can step back and look at the record, I can say what I have said. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan. Thank you for highlighting the role of inequality and poverty and what UN has been doing to address these challenges. Now we have a brief window available for a few questions. I pass it over to our Master of Ceremonies, Kajal Perwani. In case there are a few questions, can you please read out to them for the benefit of the panelists?
Yes, there are actually a number of questions. So I will be moving on with question 1 first. This is from Professor Krishnappa from RV University. How far does Professor Marks is willing to concede US long-standing policies are the real source of the recent developments in Ukraine?
Professor Marks, this question is addressed to you.
Should I repeat it, sir?
Yeah,
please repeat it, yes.
Please repeat a bit loud, yeah.
Okay. How far does Professor Marks is willing to concede US long-standing policies are the real source of the recent developments in Ukraine?
Recent developments where?
In Ukraine.
In Ukraine. Yes.
In Ukraine. Well, that let me interpret the question. The question seems to suggest that the Russian position that it is threatened by NATO and that the United States is behind building up NATO as a threat to Soviet Union and now to Russia, the Russian Federation, is a Russian perspective on this. And it suggests that NATO is something other than a defensive alliance, which is the reason for which it was established. So the United States, indeed, post-World War II and the evolution of the Cold War, built allies with an Article 5 commitment to defend one another in the case of attack. And Russia has shown that, in spite of the fact that 75 years on, Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations, that bars violating the territorial integrity or sovereignty of another country, has been violated by a major power. So it is not a matter of the US buildup of its NATO alliance as a threat. That is Putin's position. The fact is that the NATO alliance is a defensive alliance to come to the aid of a country under attack. And Ukraine is not a NATO member. Therefore, it is only in the aid that is being done. But the source of the conflict, frankly, has nothing to do with the fact that the members of the NATO alliance constitute a defensive alliance against attack, not a threat to the sovereignty or territorial integrity of the Soviet Union or of the Russian Federation.
Thank you. Professor, Kajal, can you
Yes,
go on to the
I
next
will.
question, please?
Next question. So this is for all the panelists. Does public international law based on relationships between states sufficient, or do we need a new branch of international law to deal with non-state actors?
I can try this one. But before that, just to finish on what Stephen Mark just said, if we have a 74 years of history of NATO, and in those 74 years, no single bullet ever was shot against the Russian Federation by NATO members, is not that very much illustration of the entire fantasy created by Putin. But on another hand, if NATO had any aggressive plans against Russia, what are they doing for the last 12 months? They could have a perfect causa belli to exercise those aggressive plans. NATO, again, even in the last 12 months, NATO didn't shot a single bullet against the Russian Federation. But on the question of public international law, and whether it applies also to other actors, in fact, it does. We have a development, and in many legislations, I would say the human rights treaties, the disarmament treaties, the climate change agreements, we see how important are not only the governments, but also how important are the civil societies, how important the corporations, individual people. In fact, the international law has developed significantly over the last 4 or 5 decades to make also its subject to non-state actors. They are very powerful multinational corporations, and they are also very powerful civil society organizations. In fact, several of the development with the landmine treaties, with the responsibility to protect mentioned earlier, with the establishment of the Rome Statute for International Criminal Court, are entirely supported. And I will even say more, they wouldn't happen without the major role played by the civil society organizations. And to finish on this, we see how important is the summit of the future, which the Secretary General announced for next year for the new agenda for peace and for all other suggestions which are over there on the table of international relations and international law. And the role of civil society will actually increase. I will probably say that from now on, states need support. Governments need to be supported by a major enthusiasm and activism by the civil society organization, including universities, including academia. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kajal, we can take one final question and...
Okay. I will take one final question. For professors, this is for Professor Stephen Marks. Evolutionary sociobiologist Sarah Hardy argues that evolutionary arguments for aggression, or therefore war, are given more space in scientific literature than cooperation and mutual understanding. She argues that hunter-gatherers have known to be fiercely egalitarian. In your view, what is the role of culture and custom in the evolution of war?
Unmute. Steve, you got to unmute.
So you,
Sorry, the role of culture in evolution of war history and culture is a little different from the evolutionary biology argument that the questioner started with. I think we have to separate the two, and this could be the subject of not just another 2 hours, but maybe an entire course to reflect on it. The point is that the evolution of the international system seeking to establish opportunities for international cooperation to protect human beings from violence and the harm that emerges from all of the threats to humankind is not an aberration in the history of our species. Yes, it emerged in 1945 and identify very strongly with the spirit that prevailed over the adoption of the United Nations Charter. But I consider, having looked at a lot of that literature, but not being authority on it, that our understanding of the mix between the empathetic and altruistic dimensions of human behavior that is evolved biologically over time, and the violent nature of our species has produced moments where we are reinforcing the strengths of that cooperative instinct. And it is based on a component of human nature. And that is what we're trying to build on. That is what we're trying to do to prevent these aberrations in human behavior from prevailing and restoring the hope and aspirations that motivated those who established the charter. And oh gosh, I had a quote for you that I wanted to share, but if I don't find it immediately, I'll have to give up. Yes, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts, and it is essential if humankind is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. That fundamental concept in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is reflective of human nature. And I would add that I would draw the listener's attention to the 1947 meeting that UNESCO convened of philosophers from all traditions of the world to reflect on the philosophical foundations of what might become an International Bill of Human Rights, and that indeed did become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was part of it. It was based on an understanding of human nature and the capacity of human beings to build a future to prevent violations of human rights from resulting in barbarous acts. So yes, I think that there is a scientific basis for considering that human nature is consistent with the types of world order that the UN Charter has sought to affirm.
Thank you, Professor Marks. Owing to time constraints, we are not able to take further questions, but I'll pass on those questions to the panelists. And before we move on to the vote of thanks, I just want to know whether each of the panelists would like to have one final concluding comment of 1 minute max, starting with Professor Sudarshan.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. I think, you know, I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy, and we deal with public policy. And what we have to deal with is a world which has been described as VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But we've gone further than that. We've come to a state where the world is now Bani, B-A-N-I, brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. So I think, therefore, we need to revisit how we approach knowledge and how we synthesize insights from multiple disciplines and make our knowledge truly interdisciplinary. So this applies not only to making of public policy nationally, but it applies to the making of public policy internationally. That we are now in a world that is not just VUCA, but also Bani. And therefore, we need to, we cannot compartmentalize things and say, this is peacekeeping, this is development, this is something else. I think the complexity means that all of these are interrelated, and we have a knowledge challenge that we have to make connections, figure out how insights from multiple sources, including spirituality and philosophical traditions, can help us look forward to coping with this situation. So it's no longer the case that in some, the encyclopedists in the European Enlightenment thought if you dissected something and analyzed every component and understood it, and then you put it all together, you would understand the world. No, it's very dynamic. It's constantly changing. And so we must give up Newtonian worldview, and we must embrace the worldview of quantum physics and help to understand how to go forward. That's what I'd say.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan, for these very profound observations. Professor Vasilin Popowski, your final concluding thoughts in 1 minute, please.
Yes, I will say the three biggest challenges to the humanity and its survival, I will call it the climate change, the nuclear challenge still existing for a long time, but also the new challenge of artificial intelligence. And because those challenges are global, they cannot be solved by separate governments. Very much then, there is a need of international and global cooperation to solve all challenges. However, unfortunately, the international system still very much depends on national government decision-making. Challenges are global, but all decision-making happens within governments. And if the governments think only about their re-election and how long they will stay in power and how they can benefit from that power, it will be a major disconnection between the challenges and the solutions. So my concern is that the global challenges are not dealt with by global leaders, but rather by selfish, narrow-minded national leaders.
Thank you. Professor Stephen Marks, you have any final concluding thoughts?
Well, in 1 minute, I would like to address something that we haven't addressed at all, which is the role of civil society organizations like Rotary International. And let me just suggest 4 tasks that might be considered in conflict prevention and responses to conflicts. 1, I think it is up to civil society organizations to contribute, as has been done so well currently with respect to Ukraine and Syria and other conflict settings, to document abuse and be part of the efforts to seek accountability for violations. Secondly, to provide relief to the victims of conflict. Third, to communicate concern for peace with justice, a moral grounding through the media and through intelligent ways of communicating this and overcoming biases that are reflected through social media and so on. And fourthly, to join with academic institutions in elucidating the issues, as Rotary International is doing with RV University today in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marks. These are some of the intractable questions which are threatening the survival of our very mankind. And I want to thank all the 3 distinguished panelists for giving succinct, brief, lucid answers to these very complex and very interactable questions. And thank you very much. I now hand over the proceedings to Ms. Kajal Parwani.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank the panelists again for that very informative and intuitive session. Now I'd like to call upon Principal DPS Electronic City, Rotarian Ms. Anupama Ramchandra, to deliver her vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kajal. Sitting through this 1 hour panel discussion, I'm just reminded of this quote that I have in my collection of thoughts that I keep going through. And this is the thought of Douglas Adams, and I quote, human beings who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from experience of others are also remarkable for their apparent disinclinations to do so. So it is wonderful that we had this 1 hour panel discussion on the predicament of human action by humans. Observing February as the month of peace and conflict resolutions, this panel discussion on the contemporary challenges and solutions to peace and conflict resolution, with special reference to war in Russia, was organized by Rotary E-Club of Bangalore, District 3190, in collaboration with RV University. And I'm sure all the viewers have understood now that peace is a prized commodity. History and personal experiences have taught us that peace comes at a price. It is meaningful conversations like this that we had today. It not only raises awareness about the issue, but also makes us mindful about taking sustainable actions to promote better understanding amongst humanity. We were graced with very erudite gentlemen, Professor Sudarshan Ramaswamy, Professor Stephen Marks, Professor Vasilin Popovsky, I hope I got that right, and of course, Professor Dr. YSR. Discussion was possible because of the very, very valuable inputs from these, I would say, stalwart academicians. So heartfelt thanks to all the panelists for their wonderful inputs. I'm sure you have sown seeds of thoughts in all the viewers. I would also like to extend my thanks to Rotarian Kavita Subramaniam, who's the president of Rotary E-Club of Bangalore, District 3190, and all the Rotarians who have joined in. A special thanks to Ms. Kajal Parwani, who was the MC for today. Kajal, you were like a breath of fresh air with your young energy. I would like to extend my thanks to all the participants who have joined us on YouTube for this discussion. As we draw the curtains to this panel discussion today, I would like to end with a quote by Mahatma Gandhi that peace is not absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with it. So I'm sure when we have got into a very, very empowering discussion as this, as the most evolved species in the world, if we make up our mind and we come together, we can make a positive change in this world. And I'm sure we will. Thank you all once again. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, Kajal.
Thank you so much, Kajal.